I've always had a deep passion for hunting, something I inherited from my father, who used to take me out on trips every Saturday. For this trip, I brought along 2 Remington Model 798 sniper rifles, although I carried his until we reached the spot where I usually find game. I considered taking him up to the deer hunting tower hidden deeper in the woods, but I felt that might be too much for his first experience. So we settled in an open area where I thought he'd have an easier time. Peter had already learned some basic gun safety, so I wasn't throwing him into this without any knowledge. Still, I planned to keep things simple for his first trip and maybe try more advanced techniques as he gained more experience in future outings. There was a lot of waiting that day, more than usual in that spot. I could tell Peter was getting bored. He kept yawning and sighing, and it made me worry that he'd lose interest in hunting. So, to keep things interesting, I suggested we move to a new spot, which seemed to perk him up a bit. We were only a few steps into the walk when I heard footsteps. I stopped Peter, gesturing for him to raise his rifle. But as soon as I saw a head peeking out from behind a tree in the distance, I quickly lowered his gun, relieved that he hadn't fired. I waved a little apology to the stranger, who immediately disappeared behind the tree. I wasn't sure if he was another hunter, but there was something unsettling about his face, even from a distance. It didn't quite look right, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Seeing anyone this deep into the woods was unusual, and this guy didn't seem like a typical hunter. To play it safe, I decided we should head in the opposite direction. As we walked, Peter started asking me about the man, wondering who he was. I kept my response vague, saying I didn't know and didn't think it was a good idea to go back and find out. After a while, Peter complained he was hungry, so we stopped for a quick snack. I was feeling frustrated that we hadn't seen any game yet, but as we ate, I heard footsteps again, this time closer. Peter must have heard it too, because he immediately picked up his rifle and aimed in that direction. My stomach dropped when I saw the same man from earlier peering out at us from behind another tree. I lowered Peter's gun again, noticing that he was starting to look uncomfortable. I told him to stay put, deciding to walk over to the man and confront him. But halfway there, I had a sudden realization. What was I doing, leaving my son alone in the middle of the woods? I turned back, quickly rejoining Peter and telling him it was time to head out. If I was feeling like we were being stalked, I didn't want to stay in the woods any longer. We walked calmly but steadily toward the road. I kept listening, expecting to hear a crunch of leaves or a snap of a twig behind us. Sure enough, I heard it. I nudged Peter forward and turned around, furious, to confront the man who was once again peering at us from behind a tree. I marched toward him, gun in hand, but as I got within about 30 feet of the tree, he slipped out of sight again, and then I heard a loud thud, like something heavy had fallen to the ground. I crept up to the tree, heart pounding, my gun loaded and ready. But I didn't shout. I didn't even say a word. Slowly, I approached the tree, and when I finally looked around, it was as though everything around me went silent. There on the ground in front of me was a severed human head lying face down in the dirt. There was no body, just the head. I didn't bother looking around or figuring out who had left it there. I just spun around and sprinted back to Peter, telling him to run. We made it back to our car within minutes, and I kept a sharp lookout all the way home, making sure we weren't followed. That night, I barely slept, keeping watch for any signs of danger to protect my family. The following day, I learned from my wife that 2 local hunters had recently gone missing. That's when I decided to call the police and report what I'd seen, hoping it might help their investigation. For months after that, I was cautious about going back into the woods, especially with Peter. To this day, I can't fathom how this man managed to kill 2 armed hunters, if they were the ones who had gone missing. But after some time, we gradually returned to hunting together, though that experience has never left me. It was my first time going on a hunting trip. I was 21, and my friends Anthony, Christian, Tom, and Tom's girlfriend, Diana, invited me along to some remote park in Colorado to hunt elk. Since I wasn't into hunting, I hadn't planned to shoot anything myself, but after Anthony kept asking, I eventually said yes. We packed 2 tents, sleeping bags, food and drinks for 2 days, and of course, guns. I couldn't even tell you what kind of rifle Anthony handed me. It looked like a standard hunting rifle. I wasn't really comfortable with the idea of killing an animal for sport, and I didn't see the appeal, but I wanted to give it a try since my friends were so into it. Halfway through the drive, we parked and then hiked a mile or so into the woods to set up our camp. After the tents were pitched, Anthony eagerly started talking about different hunting techniques and strategies. Everyone else seemed to be taking it seriously, so I tried joking around by asking if he might scare away potential game with all this talking. He wasn't amused and gave me a glare that let me know he didn't appreciate the joke. I kept quiet after that, figuring I'd just follow along. Not long after we set off on our hunt, we encountered a group of 3 men who immediately put us all on edge. They were big, unkempt, and dirty, with long, matted hair. They looked like something straight out of a horror movie, like they'd been living in the woods for who knows how long. As we passed, they gave us a nod, almost as if to say hello, but it was unsettling. We were deep in the forest, far from the parking lot, and it felt unnerving to run into people out there who seemed out of place. We were all relieved when they didn't follow us. And eventually, we shook off the weird feeling and resumed our hunt. After a while, Anthony managed to shoot a deer, though we hadn't seen any elk. We dragged it back to our campsite, where Anthony and Tom set to work cleaning it for our dinner. I wasn't interested in watching them skin and gut it, but I had to admit, Anthony was well prepared. He'd even brought buns so we could make venison burgers. While I didn't necessarily agree with the whole hunting thing, I was impressed by his skill and preparation. That night, we went to bed as soon as it got dark, with the fire still crackling outside. Anthony and Christian seemed to fall asleep right away, but I tossed and turned, uncomfortable in my sleeping bag. I was about to get up to go outside when I heard footsteps nearby. My first instinct was to call out to Tom or Diana, but I stopped myself, wondering who it might actually be. I lay completely still, listening intently. Then, to my shock, the zipper on our tent started to come down. My heart was racing, so I turned my head to the side, pretending to be asleep. After a brief pause, the zipper went back up, and I heard the footsteps move off in the direction of Tom and Diana's tent. I figured it must be Tom or Diana, maybe checking on us before they could sneak away for some privacy, so I decided to pull a little prank on them. I waited for a few minutes, then quietly unzipped my tent and crept over to theirs. Oddly, I noticed their tent zipper was already undone. Thinking it was a bit strange, I still moved closer, ready to startle them. But when I peeked inside, I was horrified to see 2 of those men from earlier in the day inside the tent with Diana, doing something to her. I screamed as loudly as I could, partly in shock, but also to wake everyone up. Anthony and Christian shot out of our tent, rifles in hand, and as soon as the 2 men in Diana's tent saw them, they bolted. It suddenly hit me. These were the same men we'd seen earlier in the woods. Anthony and Tom fired a few warning shots, and that's when things took an even darker turn. All around us, men who had been hiding in the bushes or behind trees started fleeing in all directions. It was as if we had wandered into some bizarre, nightmarish setup, and now they were all scattering. We rushed over to check on Tom and Diana. They were unconscious, and we realized these men must have injected them with some kind of tranquilizer. There was nothing we could do except wait for them to wake up, which thankfully only took about half an hour. As soon as they were conscious and able to walk, we grabbed what we could and began running back to the car in the darkness. That mile-long run through the pitch-black forest, knowing we'd been surrounded by God knows how many people, was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. To this day, we don't know who those people were or what they had planned. Were they some kind of reclusive, dangerous group? a family living off the grid. We didn't stick around to find out. Whatever their intentions, we were just grateful that we all made it out of there alive. I was out in the woods behind my backyard, doing some nighttime hog hunting from the tower I'd built a decade ago. It was a setup I'd put together for these exact types of trips. And for anyone wondering, yes, I had a night vision scope attached to my rifle. You could say I'm pretty serious about hunting. I don't want to drag this story out, so I'll stick to the essentials. I get that this all sounds bizarre, maybe even unbelievable, but this really did happen, and in a strange way, I consider myself lucky, or at least lucky enough to have such a chilling story to tell for the rest of my life. As I sat quietly in the tower, waiting for movement, something finally appeared. I took aim, expecting to see a hog or some other animal. But instead, I found myself looking at a person. He was a man dressed in all black, black sweatpants, black shoes, and a black hoodie with the hood pulled over his head. As if that wasn't unsettling enough, he was dragging a large sack behind him, as if he was trying to bury something. My heart started pounding, and I watched him, convinced that I was witnessing a guy in the middle of hiding a body. Just when I thought things couldn't get more disturbing, the man suddenly slowed down, and I swear it looked like he turned his head up toward me. I ducked below the edge of the wooden wall in my tower, my heart racing, feeling completely exposed. Yes, I had a rifle with me, but the thought of using it against a person was horrifying. I stayed hidden, praying he hadn't seen me, convincing myself it wasn't likely. It was pitch black, after all. But then, I felt a shift in the tower, the vibration of someone stepping on the wooden ladder. Each step felt like an eternity as he made his way up, and I remember asking myself if I'd really be able to pull the trigger if he got close enough. Just as I was bracing myself for the worst, the footsteps stopped. I heard him jump back down to the forest floor and drag the sack away into the woods. I stayed crouched and frozen, barely even breathing, for what felt like a solid 10 minutes before I finally dared to look out over the edge. The coast seemed clear, and I knew I had to get out of there to call the police. I climbed down the ladder, turned on my pocket flashlight, a decision I now realize wasn't exactly wise in that situation, and sprinted toward my house. I hadn't gotten more than 10 seconds into my run when I heard footsteps pounding the ground behind me, closing in fast. Turning to look, I saw him, practically right at my back. In a panic, I spun around and shot him in the shoulder. He screamed in pain and stumbled, and I took that opportunity to bolt back to my house as fast as I could. Looking back, maybe I should have tried to hold him there somehow, but all I could think about was getting to safety. I made it to the house and immediately called the police. They arrived within 15 minutes with a full search team, and I led them back to the exact spot where I'd shot him. We found a faint but visible blood trail leading from the area, past the sack he'd been dragging. The police collected the sack, and after following the blood trail, they found the man himself, hiding under a fallen log near a tree. He was arrested on the spot, and it turns out he was wanted for the murder of a local store owner, Jin Quen Sakanaki. I don't know the full story of what drove him to it, but I do know that this experience will be etched into my memory forever. It's a story I'll be sharing for as long as I live.